Right. So today is today's the anniversary of VE Day, but it varies. Depends on what country you are.
Like
what
so many things, it's complex. You know. So happy VE Day, way to defeat the Nazi menace.
Yeah.
But if you're in the Commonwealth, you do it on May 7th,
right?
When the signature in Reims in France was done by the military leaders of the German forces to the Allied powers.
Okay.
If you're from the U.S., you celebrate on May 8th, because that's when it was announced in the U.S. If you're from the Soviet bloc or the former Soviet bloc, you do it on May 9th. Because the Soviet Union, it wasn't good enough to have the military forces surrender in France. They wanted it to happen in Berlin, which coincidentally they had a serious military presence in,
yes.
Having just recently put a flag on top of the Reichstag. And they wanted it to be a surrender at home, as it were, for the Axis powers, and to really have the central command. Now, Hitler has already committed suicide, so it's Admiral Donitz who's in charge. But it was really important to the Allies that the military officers, the military general staff, sign the Unconditional Surrender, because there was this whole story which had come up from World War I that it was the civilian government which had sold the military out. And this was one of the things which led to World War II.
Yes,
so they wanted to get the German military on paper as having surrendered. And it had to be an unconditional surrender, which was a very controversial thing between FDR and his fellow members of the Big Three, Churchill and Stalin. It turns out Churchill, Stalin, and just about everybody in America who wasn't FDR were prepared to take a conditional surrender. But FDR, for reasons which people have spent some time analyzing, some say he just hated Germany ever since he'd been there as a student. He had issues. But in any case, he demanded an unconditional surrender, and many people saw that as prolonging the war, because Goebbels could go on their airwaves and say, look, they're demanding an unconditional surrender. We must fight to the last battlement.
Yeah.
And the same thing was demanded of Japan. And we can get Japan in a second. But so because of that, the war may have been prolonged for a certain amount, and some people even blame the Iron Curtains falling over the eastern half of Europe on this demand for an unconditional surrender. Because the last few months of the war were truly horrendous. As the Soviets marched in from the east, the Americans and other allies and the British, Canadians marched in from the west. You really didn't want to get liberated by the Soviets if you were in Eastern Germany. If you talk to people, and I have, who were growing up or lived around that time, it was a deeply unpleasant experience. And in fact, there were mass suicides, and there's a very, very high rate of suicide. And people have speculated about why Eastern Germans were so prone to committing suicide in the last few months of the war, whether it was something about the Nazi ideology, whether it was the fact that it was just really horrible, that Soviets were raping people and throwing them out of windows, and so, but you'd have whole towns drowning themselves, or all, it was absolutely a horrendous time. And it was only when Germany and its forces were completely destroyed that they were prepared to sign.
What's the difference between a conditional surrender and an unconditional surrender? What do you get to keep?
Things you might look for are, some kind of deal in terms of what can be done to you post-war, in terms of whether it's, you can march out under your own colors and so forth, whether it's some kind of terms in terms of how you surrender, whether you get to retain some kind of sovereignty in your area, whether you can transfer power to a civilian government. I mean, there are lots of things you might want. Unconditional surrenders are actually relatively rare in history. Usually, peace treaties are not decided by the complete and utter destruction of the enemy, but by one enemy realizing it's not going to win, and accordingly, it's time to get the best deal it can, right? And in fact, one of the problems with World War I is, of course, the war had not come home to the German people, and so although they knew they weren't going to win. And things were rough. I mean, there wasn't a party in 1918 in Germany. The Kaiser had to resign and it was replaced with a civilian government. But they didn't see Soviet tanks on the streets chucking people out of windows.
Yes.
And so, in a way, the myth that they'd been sold out could have been promoted.
So there was already tension about, particularly between East and West, about how to end the war, and the Reims Agreement particularly was a source of conflict.
Yes, indeed. I mean, so right, the Soviets honor the Berlin Agreement, which is the next day, but because of a time difference, it's March 9th, May 9th in Moscow. By the time they signed it at 11 o'clock p.m. This is why they did it at 11 o'clock a.m. for the First World War. It makes a lot of sense. You don't have any of these time zone problems, but in any case, so that's why it's March 9th in Czech Republic and Slovakia and in the former Soviet Union and in Russia. It was, again, this demand for an unconditional surrender extends to the Japanese as well. And while there was tremendous jubilation in the streets, in Moscow, in the United States, in most towns in the United States, in London, 1 million people may have come out to see Churchill and the King, as played by Colin Firth, address the excited crowds. It wasn't completely popular, and one place was here.
Yes, where people did come out into the streets.
They did come out into the streets.
And shockingly, these are like posh boys we're talking about.
Yes.
This is Trinity College.
Yes. Well, no, there was an incident, which, and I have to footnoting is important. This is thanks to the wonderful Hidden History of UCD blog, which, maybe I'm the only one who cares about, but wait till you hear the story, by the mysterious Sam M. Right. So if you are Sam M and you want to give us your last name, that would be wonderful. So what happens is, on May 7th, a bunch of chaps from Trinity get on the roof over the entrance, which is dangerous. If you look at the pictures on the internet, don't do it. And they, they're celebrating victory over the Nazi menace, and they fly various flags in order from top to bottom: the Union Jack, the red flag, the French tricolor, and then way at the bottom, very close to the ground, the Irish tricolor. Right, so they're whooping it up and so forth. Word of this gets to UCD, which at that point wasn't a really annoying bus ride away, but in fact, just over in Earlsford. And one Charles Haughey is one of the leaders who marches on the front arch of Trinity with apparently part of some of the crowd carrying flags with swastikas on them. Whether they had them just lying around or whether they made them, history does not record. But anyway, they come and they start sort of counter-protesting this celebration and trying to break into Trinity on the basis of the disrespect shown to the tricolor. Things get out of hand. The Trinity students burn the tricolor and throw it down to them. And then Charles Haughey and his friend grab a nearby Union Jack. Apparently there are quite a few of them hanging around Grafton Street at the time, being the day that was in it, and burns that. Right. So then they go, for reasons I don't understand at all, to Middle Abbey Street to have an angry meeting. They could have had it on College Green, but I think the police were sort of trying to move them off, keeping them out of Trinity. They have a few angry speeches go on. They go back to Trinity and try and break in, but the police batten them out of the place, and they have to go and throw rocks at the British High Representative, because we're still part of the Commonwealth in 1945.
Of course we are, yes.
Yeah. So they can't even throw it at the British Embassy because there's no embassy. So
to throw it.
So that tells you a lot about both the politics of the time and also the difference between then and now, and the kind of formative experiences Charlie Haughey might have had.
Yeah. Because that kind of mindless thuggery, who knows how that might have informed his later life.
I was thinking more about how nationalism was sort of a much raw and more recent topic for his youth. But the thuggery works as well.
Yeah, indeed. We'll take a break. We'll chat more about that time after this. Welcome back to the four people still listening after that advert for the fiscal compact. Mother of God. How could something so short be so dull? Anyway, Graham Finlay is here with us still. We are talking about the history of VE Day, which actually for various reasons took place actually on 3 different days. I suppose, as you were saying during the break there, we kind of went from one war almost directly into another war. In fact, the last bits of World War II were preparation for the next conflict.
Well, it'd be great to do all of 1945 the way we sometimes do single years, but there's an awful lot in there. So, but between May and August, when Japan finally surrenders, and you have VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day, or Victory in the Pacific Day, if you're a little more politically correct. Yes, I see you sniggering out
I'm
there.
sorry, it just has a different meaning nowadays.
Well, it's a day of triumph over the
I just had the lines of Japanese lining up outside getting manicures and things.
The Axis powers in the East. What's striking is so much happens after Victory in Europe Day, so everyone's really pleased that the Nazis are gone. However, there's still some major events to happen. So no bombs have been dropped on, no atomic bombs have been dropped on Japan at this point in May 8th. Even the serious firebombing of Japanese cities has not really begun in earnest. And there's something called the Potsdam Conference, where the powers get together again. But the big three have significantly changed. You've got the same old Stalin, he's a constant, but Churchill has lost an election, is replaced with Clement Attlee.
Right, yeah.
Whose speeches on World War II are strangely not as famous. Yeah. And FDR has died and has been replaced by Harry S. Truman, who's also speeches on World War II aren't so famous. So they're making very different decisions, but once again, they demand the unconditional surrender of Japan. Yeah. And this prolongs that conflict. Now, the Japanese were not in the surrendering business really anyway, but the big sticking point was the status of the emperor. And one of the conditions they wanted was that the emperor would be preserved and that he wouldn't be subject to the occupying power, or he wouldn't be viewed as just another politician or member of the regime to be put on trial or to be otherwise disrespected.
Yeah.
And at some point there's a bit of a breakthrough where the Allied powers say, well, look, we will not treat the emperor as a member of the professional classes and military classes. And that allows Japan to surrender on August 15th. But before that, again, the complete destruction of Japan has to happen. I mean, just in the few days leading up to the Japanese official acknowledgement of surrender on August 15th, you've got 2 bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that, of course, does put Japan out of the war, pretty much. But before that, a terrible carnage with incendiary bombs, incinerating whole cities, which are arguably worse, if anything's worse, because in terms of their death toll and so forth, have leveled the place to an extraordinary degree. So they really have been pushed to the brink. And so the Japanese surrender on August 15th, that's the Victory over Japan Day celebrated in the UK. Again, somewhat confusingly, in America, it was celebrated on September the 2nd when the formal surrender occurs on a battleship in the middle of some bay. Anyway,
yes.
and not the Gulf of Tonkin. That's another war, which actually kicks off soon after. But we'll get to stay with that. What I think is really fascinating is 6 days before Japan surrenders, the Soviet Union finally gets around to declaring war on Japan.
Yes.
You'd think they,
opportunistic, one might think.
Admittedly, they've been busy.
Yeah.
But, taking half of Germany and suffering horrendous losses, 100 million people is the number you tend to see, civilians and military. And so in those few days, they just sort of rout the Japanese forces in Japanese-occupied Manchuria and Mongolia and seize a lot of territory from the fledgling and still very, very weak Chinese regime, which is emerging, having fought the Japanese for years, and something they've been waiting for decades, Saqlain Island. The Japanese had the bottom half of Saqlain Island ever since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. And the Russians wanted it back. So they seized that in those few days. So that they're in a strong bargaining position when Japan surrenders a few days later.
So effectively, they probably saw, well, look at all this extra territory we got in the West as a result. So let's grab a bit in the East while we still can.
That's it. Yeah, and then the Cold War begins immediately. The Russians take the top half of Korea. The Americans take the bottom half. There's your next war.
Yes.
And we've still got that borderline to this day.
We do indeed, yes. And look at the jolly chap who's running the northern part of it. Although the Soviet stream into Germany was brutal to say the least, says Neo Cranky, the USSR did lose over 20 million people at the hands of the Nazis. David Mead says, I thought the war didn't officially end until the Berlin Wall came down. I think Dave's a bit confused there.
It depends on which war you're talking about. If there's some kind of legal technicality which is going on here. Maybe Dave is thinking about the occupied zones which the Allies immediately divided Germany and Austria up into when Germany and Austria surrendered. And of course, part of the justification for the wall and the Soviet troops being in there was the idea that they were still policing that zone. But they also treated the Democratic Republic of Germany as a separate country.
Yes.
So I don't know. Maybe Dave could get on to us about the details of that.
I suppose it's also worth mentioning that the end of the war also brought about the birth of the United Nations and the World Bank.
Yes. Yeah.
And what a great job they've done so far.
Both of which are created in 1945. Well, the World Bank is proposed in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, but they both come into existence in 1945. Things happen quick.
They do indeed. Graham, thanks a million for coming in to us today.